Hello and welcome to Bud's RPG Review, where I give my thoughts on role-playing games, card games and board games. To celebrate my channel passing the 4,000 subscriber mark, I've chosen to show you a game that some of you may not have seen before. Maelstrom by Puffin Books. Okay, first a bit of history. Released in 1984, Maelstrom is a 296-page paperback novel-sized book that is a self-contained role-playing game set in 16th and 17th century Britain. It was reprinted as a PDF in 2008 by Arian Games under license from Puffin, and further books were added to the range at this time. This copy is one of the original releases from back in the day, which I'd like to thank my gaming buddy Old Scouser Roleplaying for letting me borrow for this review. Right to the cover. Here we have a nice piece by Anthony Kerrins that does a good job of showing the time period well. To the inside. After we get past the content and the like, we get to the introduction. Here, the author talks about the now expected "what is a role-playing game" spiel, where they describe Maelstrom as playing in the 16th century, the age of the Tudors, though he does go on to explain that this would work equally well in samurai Japan or Roman Britain. He discusses the usage of dice in the game, even explaining that at the time, percentile dice were hard to get hold of, and that players could instead draw cards from a reduced deck. He discusses time in the game, explaining the difference between real time and game time. This is followed by the player's rules. It explains that the book is broken down into 6 chapters. The first we begin with is character creation. Characters in Maelstrom have a series of 9 attributes as a rollable number from 1 to 100. These are attack skill, defense skill, knowledge, endurance, will, persuasion, perception, speed, and agility. They also have a number of wounds which starts at 0 and goes up as the character takes blows. The mechanic behind wounds is explained later on. Characters begin with all of the 9 attributes at 30 points, and the player has 50 points to distribute among them as they see fit. All characters in Maelstrom start at age 14. The next step is for the player to choose a living for the character. We have a simple character sheet and then it moves on to the core mechanic of the game, saving throws. Whenever a player wants their character to accomplish something, they need to roll percentile dice and roll under the characteristic appropriate to the type of roll needed. There are optional rules for critical successes and failures, but otherwise that's it. We then move on to choosing a living. There are a number of livings you would expect to see in the 16th century Tudor setting that are listed here, and then it talks about women of the period, saying that the majority of wayfarers, from an entirely historical perspective of the time, were men, and the society was largely male-dominated. Women are able to choose any occupation they want apart from the priesthood, which was strictly male-oriented at the time. The first occupation is the noble, who have the advantage of being relatively rich, well-educated and trained in the use of a sword, with the downside being that once the money runs out, they have a harder time surviving than most, and the likes of disease and exposure being more of a risk to them. It details professionals, those whose job doesn't involve making things. Think architect, doctors, scriveners and clerks, detailing what you could expect being each of these professions in the 16th century. It has craftsmen and artisans, those who have a craft that requires special training, things like woodcarvers and engravers. These are split into craftsmen, who are in a guild, and artisans who operate outside the guild. There are things like armourers, blacksmiths, bladesmiths and masons. It then moves on to traders, i.e. those who sell and trade goods such as fish, wine or cloth. Again, these fall into those who are guild members or free traders. It covers the likes of butchers, fishmongers and grocers. The next section is labourers. Those who have no craft, profession or trade, they earn a living doing jobs that require little skill but plenty of hard work. This is followed by mercenaries, those that fight for whoever can best afford them. And then there is rogues, people who live on the move, oftentimes outside of the law. Sometimes these people are beggars, the sick and poor, and sometimes they are vagabonds by profession, earning their living by stealing and trickery. It also gives some examples of the period, such as the Clappendogen who pretend to be crippled and Abraham men who pretend to be mad. Additionally, we have the rules for assassins who use poisons to ply their trade. We then have priests. In the 16th century, religion is a potent force, and priests and monks are widespread. These wandering priests are what Maelstrom focuses on. They have the ability to preach, which can either inspire people or make people come to believe the priest's words. They also have power over spirits, should the referee be playing a campaign that includes the supernatural. They have 4 powers over evil spirits: detection, warding, casting out, and exorcism. All priests can read the signs that show the presence of evil spirits, be that a cold breeze or any other kind of ill omen. They can ward against spirits. This uses the priest's will and drains them, and they can cast spirits out of people and perform exorcisms on places, forcing spirits away. The last ability they have is deliverance, calling upon the divine intervention of God to help them out of an impossible situation, though it is rare that such a miracle is granted. Following priest we have travelling players, a catch-all term used to describe wandering entertainers, be that actors, musicians or minstrels. The next class is the mage. Mages study arcane lore and are often branded as witches and the like. Magic itself is interestingly implemented in Maelstrom. All mages believe in something called universal law, an energy that holds everything together and that controls everything. They believe that one who has knowledge and skills can manipulate this law to produce desired effects. These are produced by incantations, knowledge and concentration, where the mage focuses their mind. This power to change reality originates from the Maelstrom. More on that later. Learning magic is dangerous, and as such mages have to have another way of making a living that they perform alongside their studies. It takes a long time to train to become a mage. They start their studies at 14 and end around 30. Spells are cast in an interesting fashion. The mage needs to decide exactly the effect they want to achieve. The difficulty of the spells are graded 1 to 5, with 1 being a simple act of magic that may happen normally, things like extinguishing a lantern or someone slipping over, and up to 5, which are things that contravene the laws of nature, things like men flying or the weather changing. Spells are difficult to cast and drain the mage, reducing their will. This has been collated in this handy table here. Critical results can happen if rolled, and will often produce an unexpected greater effect than normal. The final class is the herbalist. These are pacifists who specialise in the art of healing with the use of herbs and plants. They train for many years and have the ability to pick and preserve herbs for various medicinal uses. It gives some really good rules on the different seasons, prices and effects of herbs. More on that later. Herbalists also have the ability to diagnose patients who are wounded or diseased and what to provide as a treatment. The next section deals with the game mechanics. It gives rules on the damage of different weapons as well as armour and lists some basic items, and it then moves on to combat. Combat is divided up into rounds, 5 seconds long, that are determined in speed order from highest to lowest. To hit, they need to make an attack skill roll. A miss is a miss. A hit elicits a defence roll to block the attack, and a block is not counted as a turn. A fail means they've hit. When characters are struck by weapons, they take a wound. Wounds are tracked separately as they heal at different rates, and they can only take a number of points and wounds equal to their endurance. Once it exceeds this, they pass out, and when it passes 100, they're dead. Unconscious characters are hit on anything except a critical failure, and the wounds add to the running total. Armour has a value which absorbs damage on each hit equal to this number. Healing is a slow process, with it taking weeks or possibly months to fully recover from a fight. Wounds heal at 1 point per week if total bed rest and treatment is being received. However, this is 1 point from each wound, so if a character has had 3 wounds, 1 3-point blow, 1 5-point blow and 1 8-point blow, a week's rest would reduce these to 2, 4 and 7 respectively. When a wound reaches 0, it's considered healed. Gives us some guidance on special circumstances and how to adjudicate them. And critical results, i.e. fumbles and hits. A critical hit is an automatic hit, and a critical fumble is a dropped weapon. A critical defence roll means they knocked a weapon out of the attacker's hand. Unarmed combat causes wounds that restore at the rate of 1 every 10 minutes. It gives some rules and experience points on advancement, and then we move on to part 3, how to play. Here it gives some good advice on party composition, party age and livings, and then it moves on to starting play where it gives advice for the referee on how to run the game, including their purpose and player dialogue, and then moves on to a historical section describing the lie of the land in the 16th century. After this we move on to the reason behind the title of the book, the Maelstrom. Use of the Maelstrom is based on the assumption that the basis of magic and the universal law is a factor in the game. When a mage casts a spell, they invoke the power of the Maelstrom, a dangerous chaos that exists outside of reality. When a mage uses magic, they create a bridge between there and here, and if a critical failure is rolled from the spell being cast, something unexpected happens, as the mage is unable to control the discharge of power and the link with the Maelstrom is broken. It also gives some rules on how to implement this in-game. Following this we have part 5, a solo adventure. This is a 47-page, choose-your-own-adventure style scenario that tries to demonstrate the character of the game. I won't spoil it here, but it's okay if a bit on the basic side. The next section moves on to the advanced rules. It does stress though that these can be added in order to make the game richer and more complex. The first to get advanced rules are saving throws, where it talks about task modifiers, pluses or minuses to a roll dependent on the situation. It covers encumbrance and how extra weight can affect character actions and endurance. It covers how livings affect attributes by raising one and dropping another, as well as the effects of having 2 livings and what happens when training is missed. It talks about how some certain specific livings are affected, and how professionals have a level of renown based on their work, and also talks about how mages can branch into specific fields such as pyromancy or hydromancy, as well as how to study magic. There is a section on experience where it covers experience through training and the maximum values that can be obtained, and then we move on to advanced combat options. It gives some optional rules on how specific weapons can have specific modifiers, and some more information on fighting multiple opponents. It then covers the effects of wounds in combat and how they can affect the performance of the person fighting, as well as going deeper into critical hits and failures, and even having some tables to roll on to produce interesting results, including the critical bodge table. We then move on to part 2, referees rules. It has a section called Starting Play, which goes over the kind of thing that we're now used to in role-playing books. How to prepare the game, the players and yourself to run a game, as well as how to effectively adjudicate a game and treat everything fairly. It goes into designing adventures, map making, and the process of writing it all down, and even briefly touches upon house rules. After this is playing the game. It goes into the idea of playing characters through an apprenticeship for most of their careers and goes into detail on travelling in the 16th century. It gives some rules on haggling, disease and how it spreads at the time, as well as infected wounds. It even goes into how to deal with play dialogue. Section 9 deals with notes on livings. Here it talks about how all the aspects of living for each class, including travel, retainers, families and money. It covers things like how long it takes craftsmen to craft things like armour and many of the other crafts of the day. It talks about traders and the kind of things they sell, even including things like spices and exotic fruits. Additionally, we have different kinds of rogue specialities, as well as priests, mages and herbalists. Part 10 is called An Adventure. Here it gives us a 26-page introductory scenario to run your group through that is not too bad. The final sections of the books are the appendices. Appendix 1 deals with herbs, and we have 18 pages of different herbs including everything needed to run them in the game, and is actually one of the best I've ever seen for any game. The final appendix gives discussion to the supernatural in Maelstrom and makes a strong case for the fact that pretty much everybody back then believed in it, with spirits, supernatural creatures and witches being the most prevalent. Lastly, we have the author's bibliography and some adverts for the first few fighting fantasy books such as The Warlock of Firetop Mountain and The Forest of Doom. For a book as old in relative role-playing terms as Maelstrom, the author has done a pretty decent job when you consider he was a 16-year-old schoolboy when he wrote this. The system, while clearly showing its age, is still perfectly functional, albeit in a fairly nondescript basic manner. The focus on Tudor Britain more than the rest of the world is fine, and the tweaking of priests of the period as defenders against the supernatural, and addition of mages and the Maelstrom, does serve to give it a bit more character and perhaps makes it more interesting than it would ordinarily have been. The system on wounds is one I actually like, as it makes combat be taken just that bit more seriously than it usually would be, and the likes of infection are another hurdle that the players face, which would in all hopes make them pick their fights carefully. Herbalists are really well done, and as I've already said, the section on herbs is very, very good and could easily be stripped out and used in another game of a similar period like Flashing Blades. Magic is interesting and designed to make the players really understand what they want to achieve and come to a consensus with the referee. The real issue I have is that the game seems to be built around a group of protagonists wandering around Britain and maybe Europe. To be honest, you could really have a ragtag team that it would be difficult to imagine would be together. Also, it took a while to get my head around the fact that a saving throw is actually a roll to succeed, not to make something less effective against you. At 296 pages, you do get quite a lot of bang for your buck, and the inclusion of a choose-your-own adventure as well as a conventional one makes it easier to delve into the style of scenario that Maelstrom has the intention of portraying. It has plenty of advice for both referees and players alike, but I feel that the dry writing style is what really holds it back in some places, and there were several times throughout where there were just wall upon wall of text that made my interest fade somewhat, but it is a book very much of its time, so it's to be expected. The art is a mixed bag with some good pieces and some not so good. Build-wise, it is very much to the standard of Puffin Books of the period, and as you can see, if looked after it will last many years beyond the 36 that this copy already has. You can grab an original copy of Maelstrom for between £15 to £30 or $20 to $40 in the usual places, though if you want the PDF and the print-on-demand copy, they can be grabbed for £15 or $20 from DriveThruRPG. I've heard the argument that Maelstrom is one of the first games that the whole grimdark aesthetic sprang from, but I haven't read it. I kind of disagree. There really wasn't anything in Maelstrom that I found grim or dark, it was just historical fact. And many of the foundations of grimdark, that of a dystopian, grim and violent world where corruption and heresy hides under every stone, is something I just didn't get from this game. The 16th century was just a bit grim, according to historical records, and this seems in many ways to be truthfully reflected in Maelstrom. While these days Maelstrom isn't exactly going to set the world on fire, it does present an interesting window into how games were designed back in the day, even though in this case it is written a bit more factually and less adventurous for my tastes, and as such it's not too bad. I give it a 6.5 out of 10. If you enjoyed this review, please make sure to hit the thumbs up, subscribe to my channel and check out my other videos. Also, if you're interested in buying this product, I'll put some links below. Lastly, if you like what I produce here, then maybe think about supporting me on Patreon or even becoming a member of my YouTube channel. Bud out.